Good morning, everyone. My name is Gustav Mikkelsen, and I would like to welcome you all to this webinar on how to integrate IGA and PAM. During this session, Nixu's Kari Vierimaa and Delinea's Chris Dearden will help you to better understand the basics of IGA and PAM, the different ways of IGA and PAM integration, and also the pros and cons of each. But before we jump into today's discussion, let me go through some housekeeping. So I would like to make you aware of that you can send us questions during the session through the question chat function that you have in the control panel. We have reserved time in the end to go through the questions that we receive. And without further ado, I will hand over to Kari.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Kari Vierimaa from Nixu. I work in our digital identity business unit, which is responsible for all of our identity and access management, IGA and PAM projects, whether that's really high-level advisory work or design and deployment projects or even continuous support. So that is what our unit does. Chris, intro please.
Thanks, Kari. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Dearden. I'm a senior systems engineer with Delinea, and I look after our customers and partners across Northern Europe.
Great. Let's get right into it. So the contents of this presentation are first of all, some definitions explaining what IGA and PAM actually mean and what are the sort of key points to observe on the features and capabilities. Then after that, we'll go through 3 different IGA and PAM integration architecture options, talk about a little bit about them, the pros and cons, and then finally a summary and a few sort of key takeaways that are important for you to remember. So definitions. This may seem at first as quite an obvious thing to talk about, but we thought that it's important to just on a high level describe, well, what exactly does IGA mean and what does PAM mean? Because us over here at Nixu, we've noticed that when we do kind of like PAM pre-study projects, meaning current state analysis and requirements gathering and target state architecture design and so on, we sort of go in to the project thinking that we'll talk about PAM and only PAM, but we end up talking about IGA anyway. And there's a couple of reasons to this. I mean, first of all, there can be a little bit of confusion and sort of overlap in the thinking on our customer side that, well, what exactly does PAM do and what exactly does IGA do? So it is good to clarify that. But also our customers are thinking about the sort of overall end-to-end process of, well, how does a user gain access to these privileged credentials and how do they operate them? And for that to happen, these both components are needed. So you do need both IGA and PAM for that. So IGA first. I'm sure you guys probably know this quite well, but the main features of an IGA solution is just, first of all, managing identity lifecycle, whether that's for internal employees, externals, partners, and sometimes even consumers. Then it also handles the provisioning of various different user accounts and access rights. I mean, these are basic functions, basic features of an IGA solution. Then it can also do more like governance type things, meaning segregation of duty, handling certification campaigns, so that, for example, when the end users or employees role changes or position changes within the organization, that might trigger a certification campaign. And then of course, just basic auditing and reporting on who has access to what, who has been requesting access, who has gained access, and why and when. So in short, IGA covers all identities and access rights, and what I've put there is a statement that says access rights are permanent, but they're in sort of quotes, because what it really means is that access rights are sort of tied into, usually they're tied into contracts. So for example, the internal employee has a contract with the company, so therefore any access right is tied into that, so that when the person leaves, all of those access rights are removed and accounts are disabled. Typically, any access right that IGA grants is sort of temporary. I mean, it's actually quite rare to have like an access right life cycle, meaning a predefined end date for an access right. So in that sense, they are permanent. And IGA doesn't really offer any real-time controls for the use of that access. That's not what it's for. It handles the granting and removing of that access, but it doesn't really actively monitor or control it. Then PAM briefly, main features, obviously securing, secure vaulting of credentials, whether that's usernames, passwords, keys, whatever. Password management, meaning, for example, automated scheduled password rotation. Session management, meaning video recording of, for example, RDP and SSH sessions, key logging, and so on. And similarly to IGA, auditing and reporting, but this time that's about who has used a particular privileged credential and when. So PAM is really all about sort of first of all reducing the attack surface. So it's taking control of, for example, built-in administrative accounts, and then of course other type of privileged accounts as well. And with the password management capabilities and session management and so on, it reduces the attack surface. And it offers you the real-time operational control of these credentials, which IGA doesn't do. So to summarize key points about the definitions, IGA happens first. It's all about the sort of identity lifecycle, and every organization has this. I mean, whether it's official or unofficial processes, or whether it's done manually or with like an automated or semi-automated IGA solution, you all have it. So that happens first, and from the IGA point of view, PAM is really just like any other business application. It doesn't, you know, PAM itself isn't in any way special from the IGA point of view. You can control the access rights from IGA into that, just like into any other application or service.
Yeah, I think it's quite a nice summary there, Kari. I mean, talking about, you know, from a PAM perspective, we want to be able to give the right people the right access to the right place at the right time, and that's quite a fine-grained operation. But you need to sometimes start with a larger group of, well, who can actually access the solution to start with, and then within that solution, what sort of role are they going to take? And the role management side of things is still, you know, still pretty critical. And to automate and to make that into a much more of a business process is where I see the IGA side of things coming in. That, you know, they're ultimately almost the gatekeepers to PAM, and then PAM is the gatekeepers to the privileged asset. Exactly.
So yes, absolutely. IGA grants access to PAM, but PAM then actually secures the use of that access. So that's exactly right. Then to the integration options. So we've got 3 of them, and the first one is a little bit weird because it says no integration. So I'll get to that in a minute. And then the 2 other ones are sort of first of all, indirect integration by using the on-premises Active Directory, and then the third one is a direct integration. So let's just go through these 3 options. So first of all, what does it mean when we say no integration? Well, this may be your starting point. I mean, depending on the size of your organization and the sort of maturity of IGA, it might be that you don't even have an IGA solution. So then you will have to handle the access right management to PAM in a different way. So you might use ticketing, just any ITSM system, ServiceNow or whatever, and have like a semi-automated process, or you can do it totally inside the PAM solution itself with completely manual processes, meaning that there's an actual person making these access right changes, the changes in the role, memberships, and so on inside PAM.
Ultimately means you've got to trust that one person to
yes, yeah,
the process and be not do anything they shouldn't do.
Exactly. And then as far as authentication is concerned, I mean, if you can integrate the authentication part of the end user to, for example, on-premises AD or Azure AD, or in fact any other centralized SSO solution that you might have, that would be a really good thing, because then typically that SSO functionality is linked to the identity lifecycle. So when the person leaves a company, then in most cases, if the leaver process is handled correctly, then that authentication will stop working. So that end user will not have access to PAM either anymore after that. You can do local authentication in PAM, but it's not perhaps the best option for exactly that reason that I just said, that then you don't have that linked to the identity lifecycle.
Yeah.
Now, pros and
local accounts are still useful, but not necessarily as the main form of authentication. It's quite good practice to have something that doesn't have any external dependencies for like a breakpoint kind of situation.
Yes,
but absolutely, yeah, you wouldn't necessarily use them for all of your access.
yes. And then the sort of generic pros and cons, and this is where it sort of gets to a little bit of a gray area, because for some environments this could be seen as a relatively secure option, even though you might be using local authentication and manual processes for handling the access rights. This is where you keep the control inside the PAM team. So just like you, Chris, just said a minute ago, that then you need to trust the person doing it, or the group of people doing it. But at least it means that you don't delegate that control outside of PAM. So you're keeping it within the PAM team or the PAM service. So in some places it might be a really good thing. Also, I mean, some environments can be very isolated. For example, sort of industrial environments, OT environments, they simply might not have that connectivity to these central services. So they might not be able to integrate with central SSO or IGA because of the very, very strict security requirements inside that environment. Although what we are seeing more and more these days, that even OT environments do nowadays actually require some kind of remote access possibility. So they are opening up a little bit, but then it has to be very, very carefully designed that it really is secure. Downsides, you don't get any visibility to the end user's access rights, meaning across all IT services. You can of course look into PAM itself and see that, okay, this person has its access rights, but you have no central overall view of which other services they have access rights to. And like I already said, you don't really have that link with the master source for the identity. And third, it doesn't really scale well because it's you are relying on manual processes. So for a couple of dozen users, that's okay. But then when you're talking about hundreds or thousands, then it really becomes very, very difficult or close to impossible. Have you got anything else to add, Chris? Any comments?
At this level, yeah, I think we've covered most of them for the taking that manual approach to it. There's times when you have to, when you don't have the option, and there's times when it's a good complement to other approaches. But yeah, if you can consider an alternative, it's probably a good idea to do so.
Okay. Then the second option, which is the indirect integration with Active Directory. So this is a very common approach and common architecture. So in this one, IGA integrates with the on-premises Active Directory, and it's used to manage obviously the AD user accounts themselves, but also the AD security groups. And PAM then is configured to use those security groups for, first of all, user and license management and access right management. So a typical use case here would be that for example, a new employee is hired into a Windows Server administration team, and maybe they themselves or their line manager goes into IGA and requests that access right, so that this new person needs the Windows Server administrator role in PAM. So IGA will add that person into the correct security group. PAM will read that group, and then that person gets the correct level of access in PAM and to the exactly the right privilege credentials. So really quite a simple and well-known architecture. Pros, really easy to set up, really quite trivial, because all IGA products integrate with on-premises AD. All PAM products integrate with AD as well, so it's really quick and easy to set up. And in this case, the access is linked to the user's identity lifecycle. Again, assuming that IGA has been set up correctly. So if you are managing those processes right, the joiner, mover, leaver processes, then the end user will get that access removed automatically by IGA when they leave the company, or maybe through a review process, a certification process. Cons or downsides could be seen as a slightly less secure than the direct integration, because now you have delegated that access control over to Active Directory effectively. So who controls your AD groups? Who's your domain administrator, or who are the administrators who can change security group memberships in AD? So in theory, a domain admin could add either themselves or someone else into a security group that then grants access to certain credentials in PAM. Now, again, if you've got your IGA set up correctly, then IGA should reconcile that and get rid of that access, so that it basically just overrides any changes. But of course, the damage may already been done. So this is a case where you need to understand that what are the risks in your Active Directory environment, and who do you trust, and what kind of controls have you got in place?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, this, because it becomes quite circular, because if you control those domain admin accounts with PAM, and you audit it.
Yeah.
It should be easy to trap, and you've also got the IGA doing the desired state for your group memberships. So I quite like the way that it almost sort of self-fixes through in that if you are to break it, you need a domain admin account, but if you need a domain admin account, you have to get in to start with, and if you do, it's then audited.
Yes.
So you know, I think people shouldn't be too concerned from a security point of view. Like, don't lose sleep over it if you're using this method, because it's if you've got that robust group management process within IGA already working, then integrating it into your PAM solution is extremely easy, as you mentioned. The challenge comes in actually understanding how to apply those permissions, bearing in mind permissions are a two-dimensional thing really within a PAM tool. You have permissions that indicate what you can access, and then roles that indicate what you can do with the permissions that you can access. And that you can use group management to control that in an extremely fine-grained method. And I think that's one of the really nice things that with this particular method. And I think you can do it with the next method we'll talk about as well. But you can control not only role permissions but access permissions as well within the tool using this method.
Yeah. So yes, that's probably the AD integration is probably the thing that we are seeing most often. We've deployed it many times, but we have also deployed this one, which is the direct integration. So in this option, Active Directory is not used for access right management. It may still be used for authentication, because those two are for, two different things. So you can, independently of the access controller, you can use either AD or any other source for SSO. But anyway, in this option, IGA integrates directly with the PAM solution using an API. So IGA will, after this kind of a similar request and approval process, it will actually provision and deprovision user accounts in PAM directly, and it'll also do the access right management, role additions, group membership additions, whatever they may be. So from the end user point of view, this looks exactly the same as the AD integration. It's exactly the same. So they go to IGA and request an access right, and then IGA does its thing. It's just that in this option, AD is not used. So pros and cons, more secure than AD option. Again, slightly debatable. I mean, you can argue that, well, again, who do you trust? Do you trust your IGA service administrators? I think maybe, especially in larger environments, there are typically more AD administrators, as in total number of them. There's a larger group of administrators compared to the IGA environment, but obviously that is very much case specific. But you could say that IGA typically has less administrators that compared to on-premises AD. So yeah, you need to evaluate that risk and decide what you want. Cons, most complicated and costly to set up. The AD integration option is very easy, like I said, because it's so well supported, so that you can easily do that through the IGA and PAM solution GUIs. But in this option, you do need to know the API and be able to do the correct operations through that. So it is slightly more complicated. Complicated to set up.
Potentially more moving parts, as you might say, with this solution. Even if you're making use of kind of one of the sort of the common protocols, like the SCIM protocol, that the connector for that needs to be set up and configured, and that integration, it's not next OK kind of install, so it does need a little bit more work. But I think, bearing in mind what we were saying around the sort of the indirect method, do you think this method could be even more fine-grained rather than just using the groups method? Could you be more precise about the permissions that you grant with this particular method, simply because of the ability to be more granular within the IGA tool?
Maybe, yeah, but potentially. I suppose that depends also what you are, whether you're using SCIM or some other API. Then what exactly are you capable of doing through that API? So yeah, maybe. I mean, if you for some reason have a really granular setup, then in the AD integration options, it's a bit of a chore to set up all of those groups and make sure that they are the correct ones, and then do the group linking into that access right or role or whatever you have in the PAM solution. So that might be in some cases a lot of work. Yeah. So if you're bypassing AD completely, then you sort of skip that step. Obviously, you still need to specify what you want, obviously, but maybe a direct integration in that sense would be a little bit better.
Yeah.
Another thing that I thought about, which is not mentioned here, is speed. Just the speed of the provisioning. It might be important in some environments. I mean, typically not really, but in some cases, when someone asks for an access right in PAM in order to be able to use a privileged credentials, maybe sometimes the speed of provisioning would be important. So in this option, IGA would do it directly in PAM, so it's effective pretty much immediately.
Yeah, I mean, IGA is pushing directly into PAM in that scenario, isn't it? Whereas certainly with our tool, and we're doing Active Directory syncs, I mean, by default that's once an hour. So you mentioned before, and I think we qualified it pretty early, that IGA is not designed for real-time permissions. And we're not saying push an IGA group change out for a 5-minute change and then back again. But it's probably quicker than.
Yeah. Okay, so that's our 3 options. So key takeaways about IGA and PAM integration. First of all, understand that IGA really is an integral part of securing privileged access access as well. So it's not only about what happens inside the PAM solution. Then the right integration method for you is always very case specific. I guess the AD integration option is the most popular. It covers most cases, but you may have a very specific type of environment, like I said earlier, maybe industrial environments or OTs or separate networks or something like that, where you need to think about other options. And then really pretty much all the rest of it here is the stuff that is, in my opinion, the most important takeaways. That always look at the big picture. I mean, specifically also outside PAM and IGA. Just look at the overall kind of like security setup and security landscape that you have. So make sure that you've taken care of patching your systems, updates, virus protection, network level security, endpoint control. Do a risk and threat analysis. Where do you think the threat is coming from? What exactly are you protecting yourself against, because the privileged credentials really are the sort of crown jewels. Those are the ones that any kind of attacker wants to get their hands on. So they will find a way in, and quite often it's like an unmanaged, unpatched server right at the edge of your network, or then some kind of a way to gain access to just normal end user credentials first, and then try to elevate their access rights into being administrators. So think of that whole path, the whole sequence of events that might happen, and make sure that you are protected even before this attacker gets anywhere near those privileged credentials. So that's, in my opinion, a really, really, really key point.
Absolutely. Yeah, neither tool on its own is going to give you guaranteed security. It's how it's implemented is going to be really the key piece here. And I like to use sort of a hotel analogy when I'm talking about PAM, and the PAM tool is a little bit like the guy at reception who prints you your room keys, and that you prove that you've got access to this room key and you have access to the room for the duration of your stay. IGA is like the doorman of the hotel, so he's actually, if you're not even looking clean enough to come into the hotel, he's not going to let you hotel in the first place. But yeah, it's not just those components that are going to give you the overall security of your precious belongings. You have to consider, CCTV in places. You have to consider, things that are working, looking at threat behavior and things like that. So yeah, there's definitely a lot more to consider. But PAM is, I think, it's a very low-hanging fruit, relatively speaking, from how much you can improve your security posture for a relatively small project compared with maybe some of the deeper projects that you can get into.
Yeah, exactly. I think with that, I will hand this back over to Gustav. Gustav, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Even though you can see. Yeah, now.
Yeah. You're
great.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for the walkthrough and the discussion, Kari and Chris. We have received a few questions here. So the first one is how to get started, and also how to select the right integration. I guess it's some kind of combination, but what would you say about that?
How to get started? I think that first of all, try to forget the technology first. So really go back to getting your requirements right. What is it that you want to achieve? What's the problem that you're trying to solve? I mean, this is what we emphasize over and over again to our PAM customers when we have these advisory type projects, pre-studies and so on. Because sometimes customers come to us with a tool and they said that, okay, well, we've bought this tool and we want you to implement it, and we want to do it the other way around. So it also applies to this integration part that, well, if you think about different options for integration, then you need to understand that what your requirements are, and well, have you understood the risks and the threats in the environment, and then go and select the correct integration method and start working on that. So that's my view. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, from a PAM perspective, and I imagine from an IGA perspective, you can have a similar set of problems of trying to do everything at once. Start kind of break these tasks into sort of more manageable chunks, just as you don't
good point.
deploy PAM, you don't go from 0 to 100% immediately. I would imagine it's the same with IGA. You start to onboard given processes, business lines, applications within IGA as you mature those IGA process.
Yeah.
And we mentioned that PAM is just another application to IGA, so there's probably other steps that you can do to, I guess, build confidence in IGA as a tool, and getting people used to requesting access through that particular process. And once they're used to that, then requesting access into PAM is going to be really, really easy. So you've kind of conditioned your estate to look at the world in that way, in that form of access, and look at the contracts, and knowing that things have to have potentially an end date and a good reason and all that sort of good stuff. Would be, I think, a great approach to take with it.
Yeah.
I've got a question actually. Do you think you can do these in parallel, or should you do one first?
Oh, okay. That is a really good question. We have actually done that. We have done deployments where we've deployed both IGA and PAM from 2 different vendors, all at the same time. So I think you can do it, and then it sort of becomes a question about availability of resources, particularly on the customer side. That can they actually commit to that kind of project, because that's a big project.
A lot of things within the business, I guess.
Yeah. So you're not only changing or modifying identity lifecycle processes and access right management processes, but then you're obviously then quite heavily changing the actual everyday tasks for administrators. I mean, in some ways they are different people, so it's not like we're talking about the exact same group of people that would be doing this, but it's just that the amount of change in the organization and the processes is so large that it becomes a little bit risky. So I think maybe what I would do is I would recommend deploying like a base solution for IGA first, just taking the identity lifecycle processes under control, making sure that they work, making sure that sort of simple birthright access rights work, so that everyone gets an AD account, everyone gets an Azure account, Office services, whatever. Because the better you have those under control, then the more secure PAM is. Because we talked about earlier in the presentation about how it's good to have the PAM access right tied into the identity lifecycle. So that's why it would be really, really beneficial to make sure that you've deployed IGA really well with a limited scope first, and then go into PAM deployment, because just like you said a minute ago, that scoping is important. So you just don't try to do too much at the same time, because then it will become problematic. You then risk delays and cost overruns and so on and so on. So just try to keep it simple and just do one thing at a time. That's my view.
Brilliant. Certainly consider that when I talk towards customers. It's I don't often sort of necessarily call out IGA as a specific technology, but I always talk about having that robust process for AD group management and for enabling disabling AD accounts, which is IGA under a slightly different name, or that particular aspect of it anyway.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think my takeaway is that I'm actually going to start calling it out as a technology, because it just saying it's clever AD group management is probably a bit disingenuous. So yeah, my takeaway is that yeah, I'm going to start calling it by its proper name.
Yeah. And of course nowadays a really interesting thing that is now starting to happen is that you are starting to get, or you can get, both IGA and PAM from the same vendor. So if you happen to be in a situation where you don't have either one of these, or maybe you have some old legacy IAM product that is at the end of life, or you know, whatever, is not good enough anymore, and you have the chance to sort of build this up from scratch, then now you have the option of actually getting this whole package from the same vendor, which then offers you some really interesting integration benefits, because obviously those two products will integrate really well, and they might be sort of modular in structure, and they'll use the same workflow engines and so on and so on. So there might be quite a lot of benefits to get there. I mean, obviously not every organization is in that position. Quite often we see IGA solutions already being deployed, and then the customers want PAM as well, and then you need to go back to these integration options that we presented here. Anything else, Gustav?
Yeah, there's actually one more question here, so, and we have time for it. So yeah, key success factors. What are those for IGA and PAM, and do they differ?
Yeah, from a PAM, those measuring the success for a PAM project, there's a number of ways that you can quantify it. Sometimes it's just the simple, you know, now we've deployed PAM, we've been able to be quoted and get our cyber insurance renewal, which is a pretty binary success factor. But you can look at more quantitative ones, like, you know, reduction in number of admin accounts. You know, if you're able to measure that attack surface, we said right at the beginning, you know, the aim is to reduce that attack surface. So that's always a nice way of saying, yeah, a successful project is one that has reduced our attack surface and continues to do so.
Yeah, and what I would add is, well, I'm repeating myself because I'm going back to scoping. So scoping is incredibly important, so you don't try to do too much. That goes for both IGA and PAM. PAM is a little bit different because you can actually implement PAM in a very small scope if you want to. You can't really do that with IGA. You need to at least get the lifecycle processes in place. The other thing is stakeholder involvement and management support and sponsorship. Because if you try to run this kind of project, whether that's IGA or PAM deployment or integration, if you try to run it as an IT project, then there's a high risk of failure, in my opinion, because then you don't have the buy-in, you don't have the commitment from all of the stakeholders, and in the worst case, not even from management. So make sure that you involve all of the relevant stakeholders as early as possible, so you get their involvement, get their commitment, and get the requirements for them. It's like, what are you trying to achieve? What do you want from this? So I think, in my opinion, that's really important.
Yeah, interestingly enough, that answer. We've had a question sort of come in from Anders. In your experience, what are the typical mistakes that cost an organization a lot later on? So, you know, what are some don'ts? You know, we've talked a lot about the do's.
Okay.
Yeah, not getting stakeholder buy-in at an early enough stage, I would say, from a PAM point of view, is massive. If you want a project to fail, don't talk to the end users. It's probably the quickest way to do it. But from your experience in the field, what else would you come across as like big red flags?
I think that's for PAM. I think that's absolutely the one. I mean, if you don't involve the end users, if you don't go and speak to the actual future end users of PAM, then you don't get your requirements. You won't be able to design your use cases, your processes, because in the end, you want the end user experience to be as smooth and easy as possible, while at the same time actually increasing security. So you can't do that if you don't get the information from the end users. So you might end up deploying a PAM solution that no one wants to use. So that's not a good place to be in. So yeah, totally agree with that.
Yeah, I think the other big one from a PAM perspective, I don't know if there's any sort of particularly good IGA tips. Maybe we can look at those. Around workflows, and just because you have the option to create multi-level workflows, you need to scale those with the level of privilege and the type of account that it's used for. I saw some requests from a customer recently. They wanted to have workflows with up to 3 levels in them. Now, depending on what that account is supposed to be doing, a 3-level workflow potentially is going to need minimum 3 different people to approve it.
Yeah.
And those people all have to be in the office and awake and available and potentially looking at their mobile device or email or Slack or application at the time for you to be able to do your job. That's 3 big points of failure for you to be able to get on and do your job. And it's just like, okay, for something that's really important and key, you need that. But when things are on fire and you need to fix it and one person's off on holiday, sorry, that workflow has just failed. And you had to go to break glass, and no one really wants to be going to break glass as part of the business as usual procedure. So understanding the appropriate level of permissions and approvals required for the type of privilege that's in use, I think is pretty important.
Yeah, to me as well, that process sounds really, really heavy and just too much. Typically, what we see in customer cases that in most cases, there's no real requirement to actually implement approval workflows for the privileged credential access. I mean, IGA does its thing. The end user, the administrator, gets the access to PAM, and then after that, he or she can simply do their job. So they can go to PAM and start sessions and do whatever work they need to do. And in most cases, customers they don't see any need to actually have an additional approval workflow for every single time that administrator wants to use that credential. It just slows everything down. It just stops. The only case I can think of was an industrial environment that we talked about with a potential customer a little while ago. And in this case, it's understandable because we are talking about a critical part of infrastructure, and they want to enable external service provider personnel access into the environment in order to do maintenance and upgrades and troubleshooting. So this service is monitored and controlled 24/7. So there's always someone there. So if an external provider, maintenance guy needs access, there's always someone there to review that request and say, okay, this is valid, I can let you in. But that's a very particular kind of environment where that would be okay to have.
It's totally appropriate to the type of privilege required because you're going into an extremely sensitive environment, and the controls around it absolutely reflect that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, there was another question come through. Management tend to like tangible data. There have been trends of data showing admin users have been increased attack path lately, or other intel that would motivate PAM investment. So yeah, Privileged credentials are the first thing that an attacker comes from in something like 95% of breaches involve privileged credentials. Whether that's ones that have been discovered in a script, as was done fairly recently, I'm not going to name a particular company, but there was a very high profile breach recently. And that breach, once someone had managed to get a low-level credential through, I believe they were MFA spamming, they were able to start looking through some file shares, and they looked through some file shares and they found some scripts. And in those scripts was a privileged credential to a PAM system.
Yes.
So someone not only put a hard-coded credential in the script, that hard-coded credential was an account in a PAM system that had access to quite a lot of other accounts, which is bad.
That's the worst thing, and that's when we get to actually the sort of last line on the slides that's visible now, that this is not technology but it's process and guidelines, and unfortunately us humans are usually the weak link, because then we do stuff like what you just described, which is just stupid. So technology can't fix that, not 100%. So you do need proper processes, controls, guidelines to make sure that that doesn't happen, hopefully. Or if it does happen, it is detected as quickly as possible and fixed immediately. But that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, and there's actually a follow-up question then to the previous question. So, Chris, do you have a source to that data that you just mentioned?
Yeah, for around privileged accounts being used in the high percentage of breaches. It's been in the news reasonably recently. I don't happen to have it to hand, but I did mention I think you've got their contact details for the particular asker, and we need to make sure we follow up after the call.
I'm sure we can find that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we will share it after the webinar. Great. Kari, Chris, do you have any more questions to each other or comments?
No, not for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me. I think it's the main my main feedback has been.
Yeah. Okay, but it seems like we are coming to an end then with this webinar. So if you have further questions, comments, or would like to have more insights on this topic or cybersecurity in general, then don't hesitate to contact us. And you'll receive a follow-up email with a full recording of this webinar. And also, please spend a few seconds on our survey before you close your browser. So with that said, I would like to thank you for joining us today, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.